Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to present the European Union's cybersecurity agency's role and input to the Luxembourg Internet Days. I hope that you can all hear me and also see the very short slideshow that we have prepared. And I would now like the organizers to go to the first slide. I think overall, when we talk about the European cybersecurity framework, we often neglect that the very important step of building it was done in 2016 when the NIS directive was adopted. And we are now in full swing of the implementation of the Network Information Security Directive. And this is kind of a baseline of action on cybersecurity at the European level. So now when we are all geared up into the announcement of the Commission in December, and waiting the Commission to put in place the new European cybersecurity strategy and the review of the NIS directive, I think it also would be a good place to step back and see what the NIS directive so far has accomplished and where still are the gaps. Now, we made a very small and targeted study whereby we surveyed 250 European companies that fall under the scope of the NIS directive in 5 member states. So it's not too representative, but it gives you some sort of a feeling where things are. And the good thing, of course, that we found out is that over 70% of these companies said that they have a dedicated program in place in order to tackle cybersecurity challenges. And I think that is a major difference between the current state of play and something that was there 5 years ago. And not only the companies, but the member states. All of the member states now have national cybersecurity strategies. They have programs in place in order to build capacities and tackle cybersecurity issues. So in terms of the framework and the overall environment, it's remarkably different from 5 years ago. However, what we found out that there is still scope for development. And one of these issues is, of course, that 70% of the companies do have dedicated programs in place, but still around 1/3 of the companies say that it is unclear what is expected of them. So it's not only the question of that 30% don't have dedicated programs to deal with cybersecurity issues, but both when you look at these companies that have and don't have these specialized programs, they say that 1/3 of them say that they don't understand still clearly the goals and where we want to move in terms of developing cyber resilience. Then when we look at the investment part of it, then of course this directive has been a major force in driving investment in cybersecurity, both in public and private sector. But still, almost 1 in 5 of the companies that fall under NIS in our study said that they have a lack of resources, a lack of investment into this area. And 1/3 of the companies who did not have the specialized program for cybersecurity said that investment is a big issue. And this, of course, is still a problem because what we see in terms of the cost of incidents that these companies have to bear, they all report that the financial damages have been there. 25% of companies had financial damages between 250,000 and 500,000 euro due to the last major security incidents they faced. So lack of investment means that you always deal with the consequences, and normally these consequences do have financial implications. So we do have still some work to do, and that's why I would like to dedicate some time on what could be the potential elements in the new cybersecurity strategy that the Commission will come forth. Of course, I'm speculating here, it's the Commission's decision to put the policy framework, but looking from the agency perspective, what do we would like to see in the strategy? So next slide, please. The scope, of course, is quite wide, but I would just focus on three elements. The first is clear goals and broad strategic guidelines. We do have a need of political commitment at the European level to set in place the broad avenues and the broad issues where we need development in terms of cybersecurity. And this is necessary because if we don't have a consensus on this, it's very difficult also to see how we can leverage our financial, political, research, innovation, and policy tools to tackle these challenges. And of course, only when we have these kind of a framework in place, then you can also build coalitions around the ecosystem involving not only public sector actors and private sector actors, but everybody who is involved. As we like to say in ENISA, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, and we cannot only act alone. We need a coordinated action of all relevant parties in order to reach our aims. So how can ENISA help there? Let's say we have a wish list, but also, of course, we are committed to make sure that we also contribute into raising the overall level of cyber security across the Union. Next slide. First, of course, is where the agency can help is to understand the landscape, understand the different gaps and challenges that we face. And this is not as easy as one would guess. Cybersecurity is a relatively novel policy area at the EU level as well. And that means that it has not yet so far reached the maturity where we can assess the performance of these policies, the efficiencies of these policies. But with these steps that have been taken over the past years, the NIS directive, the new Cybersecurity Act, and now with the new strategy, I think we are much more closer to the level where we can start measuring the level of cybersecurity, because we need to have fact-based evidence and understanding of the world around us in order to tackle the problems. If we look the current state of cybersecurity across the EU and member states, we do have some understanding where the countries are, where the major problems are, but we lack the granular understanding of it at the European level. We don't really follow up consistently and systematically and on the question of what is the impact of cybersecurity policies and guidelines. Are we getting better at cybersecurity, and if so, by how much? And can industries quantify and justify the impact of cybersecurity? So in the end of the day, of course, it's an issue of how impactful is any kind of a action at the European level, and including the impact of the agency itself. So we need more quantitative data and metrics for cybersecurity, and this is something that I'm happy to announce that the agency will undertake in its work program next year. We'll try to start developing the kind of a coherent approach, which would eventually, hopefully, mature into this overall index of cybersecurity of Europe that we could use. Next slide, please. The other issue that I mentioned is investment, and there as well, what we've seen is that Europe has already taken a step forward. With the recovery plan, 20% of the funds are earmarked for digital investments and reforms. That means that the investments that will be rolled out in the course of the next years will have to include a minimum of 20% of expenditure to foster the digital transition. And of course, the Commission is now developing a methodology to ensure that this investment is channeled to both infrastructure and digital capacities. Now, when Europe rolls out these investments and when the member states and private sector actors undertake activities in order to put them into practice, that also means that we need to look at the cybersecurity angle of it and make sure that these investments will also contain a investment in cybersecurity. We need to roll out the digital investments in a way that they are cyber secure from the start, rather than deal with the consequences later. And I think a very good example of this is the German initiative. Jens Spahn, the German Minister for Health, has announced that 15% of digitalization of healthcare funds will be spent on IT security. And I think this is a kind of approach that should be emulated across the field in different member states and also in the EU. Next slide, please. Finally, one big issue is how to tackle legacy systems. And I think this is something where we also look guidance from the strategy. And this is where the connecting the different dots between investment policy, industrial policy, the research policy will make the biggest difference. Most of the cross-border large-scale cyber attacks have happened because somebody or someone has exploited vulnerabilities in legacy systems. When you talk about WannaCry and NotPetya, all of them exploited vulnerabilities in legacy systems. And when we talk about cybersecurity certification schemes, or when we talk about capacity building activities, we mostly talk about the future. We talk about building resilience towards the future. But we also carry the past with us, and we need to have an understanding how we deal with the past, how we deal with the legacy systems. Now, the best way to deal with it, of course, would be to have a strategic approach on how to phase out the legacy systems, how to make sure that any kind of a digital investment, any kind of a digital infrastructure has a built-in best before date, after which it will be reviewed and upgraded if necessary. And this is a kind of a policy approach that is necessary in order to make sure that also in the future, when we build our digital infrastructure, when we develop our digital infrastructure, that we don't build and develop it on the basis of a shaky ground. And that is why it is extremely important that we do have a kind of a policy how to tackle legacy systems. Now, this policy cannot be just public sector driven. It has to be done in partnership with the private sector actors. And it has to be done consistently and systematically. And one approach, of course, to deal with legacy systems is, well, they will disappear. Guess what? They don't. And it's increasingly clear to everybody who deals with also, for example, telecommunications, that when we talk about securing the 5G, we also look back of the infrastructure that we built when we built the 3G and 4G, and they are part of the game of securing the future of our high-speed connectivity. Next slide, please. Finally, the issue of empowering communities. As I mentioned, the strategy should build a framework through which we engage with our partners, not only in order to build a more resilient digital infrastructure in Europe, but also to make sure that we can use these partnerships during crisis. Private sector players are normally the first in line to see and to be hit by big cyber attacks. And I think we need a good and solid collaboration framework within Europe in how to exchange information, how to exchange best practices, how to help each other during crisis between the public and private sector actors. And this kind of a dialogue is necessary for any kind of a policy to be efficient. And we've seen that also in the framework of the Network Information Security Directive, through the different dialogues that we built in the form of the information sharing and analysis centers, or the ISECs, or the informal contacts that we've had with the sectors during the COVID crisis, how important they become. And I think this is something that we can only foster in the future. Finally, and next slide, of course, the strategy needs to also help different communities, member states, and constituents. And I'm very happy to see Luxembourg taking cybersecurity extremely seriously. Luxembourg has a very good track record when it comes to cybersecurity, but also digital policies. We've seen that across Europe now during pandemic, SMEs were one of the most hard hit in terms of cyber attacks. Luxembourg-based SMEs experienced the security incidents in the last 25% of Luxembourg-based SMEs experienced security incidents in the last 5 years. This is not unique for Luxembourg. I mean, if you look at the numbers across globe and Europe, I mean, it's around the same or even higher. So, and I'm happy that ENISA can help to build resilience. We have dedicated guidelines for SMEs, and we've reached out to the different communities across the policy areas in order to see how we can help to build a secure environment. The world out there is not always pleasant, and we've seen that during the pandemic as well, where we observed a more than 600% increase of phishing attacks. That means that you receive an email or text message that is pushed by an actor who wants to steal your credentials, steal your digital identity, or steal your data. And people fall into these attacks more and more. And of course, this is something that only jointly we can tackle and find a system and policy framework to make it harder for cyber criminals to exploit these kind of gaps and holes. So the last slide, what I hope when we meet again during the Luxembourg Internet Days in 2021, that we have a cybersecurity strategy in place that puts a new vision for digital decades for Europe, that offers added value, that includes a clear performance review of how these different goals will be measured and followed up, that is flexible and allows us to build a solid response to new challenges, and also include a European community mindset in it. So this is something that's it's not only for all of us, but particular is important for the agency. So thank you again very much for offering me this opportunity to talk to you. I don't know if we have still any time for questions, but if we do have, then I'm happy to answer them.